That's Haida. She's pretty, isn't she? She's big as well. I've been studying these ships now for a very long time. And I was gonna come see them before COVID. I had the money saved up. I was gonna come. It's gonna be part of my book. Looking at the Canadian and Australian destroyers. But that didn't happen. I've got to start remembering I'm British and I'm not supposed to cry. Yeah, there she is. Can't get on her at the moment. She's locked up, which is probably a good thing, because that might mean that by tomorrow I'll be slightly better. But yeah, I couldn't resist walking out. I got to the hotel and I went for it. I don't feel like driving. Too tired for that, but I'll walk. She's a beautiful looking ship. And it really annoys me that she's the only one left, because whilst she deserves to be left, there are so many others which deserve to be left with her. Now you got Nubian, which, because of the way you count destroyer battles versus battleship battles, doesn't have as many battle honors as Warspite, yet certainly deserves as many. You have Eskimo, which lost bowels and still somehow survived World War II. She lost bowels. You have Asante. She didn't get to survive either. She should have done, but she didn't. And you have Tartar. Lucky Tartar. A very good ship. A very happy ship. But she didn't survive either. All of them got lost to the breaker's yard. All of them. Welcome to HMCS Haida and the Traveller class. I hope you're going to enjoy this video as much as I enjoyed creating it. It was of course part of our trip to Canada. And I hope you like what I'm trying for an intro. So, say if you like it. Thank you very much for watching and hope you enjoyed it. Hello! Hello. So, this is something different. This is definitely something different to me. There is often discussion of when men should cry. My grandfather thought the rules about those sort of things were stupid, and I agree with him. Honestly, seeing Haida for the first time, and I will never forget that emotion. Because I'm not one who has a lot of emotions, I have to admit. I'm fairly reserved as a human being. Well, it was something kind of interesting for me. It really was. All the stories of the Traveller class flashed in my mind, and I immediately knew any video I did about her would not be just about Haida. It could be. You could make a whole multi-part series. You could do a Band of Brothers-esque Haida documentary quite happily. And you would have material left over for multiple seasons. But it couldn't be. Because all the stories, all the history flashed through my mind. You know, one of the things we talk about on this channel quite a lot is Eskimo losing her bow. I'm going to make a bit of a joke of it to an extent. Because the reason we do is because it's such a massive event. A ship loses its bow, it loses its forward gun position with its both guns go. All the crew for that gun, for that mount, go. All gone. And yet they're in such a fight. They're in such a moment of fury, of passion, of smoke, of thunder. They don't stop. They carry on fighting. And eventually they're advancing sternwards towards the enemy, with their guns blazing. Because they've continued the turn they were doing, and then at a certain point you have to stop putting pressure on the bow. And so going sternwards makes sense because, you know, you're taking the pressure off weight off the front of the ship, which has lost its bow. It's, you know, it's the internal bulkhead taking the pressure. There are all sorts of logical reasons for it, but still they do it. It's history. I have a little joke going on here. Back pocket, corgis of the sea, walkies of the world, cruisers. Back pocket cruisers. HMS Haida, the last survivor and our sisters of the 1936 tribal class. Perhaps a sad story to start off with for Christmas Day. But this video is going to be about their stories. It's not going to be about the facts and figures. It's going to be about the stories of the class. It's going to be about the ships. And the first thing I would like to say is A, thank you for Pen and Sword for allowing me to publish my first book. Shameless book plug. But also I want to say thank you to the very kind people who let us aboard Haida. That is Parks Canada, who now have authority over the ship and now look after it, and the Friends of Haida, who take wonderful care of them. Frankly, the team were amazing. There was a change of command, change of leadership. We'd arranged everything with one lady, and she literally came in when she was no longer on post because she was transferring to another park, another site, and was coordinating stuff for us, so that newly introduced us to the people who were taking over, interested in team leads. They were fantastic. They were really, really kind and really helpful, and they were so in awe of the ship they were taking care of. And having had the pleasure of seeing their service at other sites across Canada, I have to say they do an absolutely exceptional job. A very, very problematic job, I have to admit, because they have to work and walk the fine line between preserving the history and the heritage and providing safe access to the history and the heritage. And during COVID and all the other things, that must have been, and I'm sure continues to be, an absolute nightmare. And with Haida, for so many years, she'd been preserved by the Friends of Haida. They had looked after her independently, and they had taken such good care of her. But the way they could run it versus the way the Parks of Canada could run it, there are freedoms to being a smaller organisation. There are freedoms. You don't have to have any standardisation. You don't have to have any of those things. And yet, both groups were working so hard together to make sure they did the best they could to preserve Haida. And honestly, I can't say anything higher about them. They were wonderful. They were all wonderful people. There is one who has my eternal sympathy for, well, both me and Drac were clambering over things while we were there. And, well, one had the immortal task of trying to get Clarke down from a mast. She got him down. She did well. You weren't supposed to climb it. But no, it was just wonderful. And also the people of HMCS Star, you cannot say nicer things about them and the Royal Canadian Navy and their support. And frankly, they were just lovely. They were just lovely people and really kind and really caring and really helpful. And I will say this, there's a picture of her later, not in uniform, because I wasn't sure whether I should put a picture of the officer in uniform who's looking at us from Star, who was actually the commander of Star at the time. Spectacular. Very smart, very capable. If I was the Canadian Navy and looking at my commanders and captains and working out future leadership of the Navy at more senior ranks, she'd definitely be on my list. Definitely. So, the tribal class story. Where does it begin? Well, in my book, I begin it with the Royal Navy of the 1930s. And actually, I begin it with the loss of one of the Royal Navy's tribals. But, moving on from Mashona, who we'll talk about in a bit, by the mid-1930s, the Admiralty and other departments of the British government, such as the Foreign Cabinet officers, were having to confront the fact that they had fewer warships to meet the same, arguably greater, level of commitment than before the First World War. After the war, the Navy had evaluated its operational needs, assessing a requirement for 70 cruisers in order to fulfill its peacetime duties. However, due to international treaties, financial constraints, and the requirements of maintenance, it never really had more than 55 available during the time period. A shortage made much more difficult by the fact that by 1936, only 23 of these could be called modern. As part of the solution to the problem, the Navy designed and built the Tribal class destroyers, a class specifically intended as general-purpose ships able to undertake both cruiser and destroyer duties. Although not as good as purpose-built vessels for specialist roles, they were designed to be good enough, and as such provide much of the required capability where and when needed. The coming of the Second World War would prove the worth of this concept, and as has been said already, the class would have become heavily relied upon. The beginning, however, was less certain. Less certain because the treaties had created them. The treaties created this tribal class. The treaties created them because there was a need for something in between the destroyers and the cruisers. And you either started allowing it in the treaty and put a specific form in it for it, the super destroyer, destroyer leader definition, or you accepted that people were going to start cheating even worse than they already were. That's the fun thing when you think about it. The fact that people were already cheating. They were cheating tremendously. Everyone was cheating. There were still decisions made which were more problematic. This one is a classic example of it. The twin 4.7-inch gun. A wonderful mount and a wonderful weapon system. But you'll notice they can only go so high. They are limited by their design to 50 degrees. Which means they're not good for high angle fire. Now, we've already had a whole video recently which sort of stole some of the stuff from what this video could have been if it had been more technical, discussing the problems with the 4.7 inch, and because the fact it wasn't able to do high angle, because during exercises everyone of course went for the sexy capital ships and the carriers. Well, that meant that they couldn't, and I say this lightly, they couldn't really engage with ships, with aircraft coming in at high angle and to attack them. They hadn't needed to. Exercise had shown it wasn't necessary. Of course, exercises are short-term events where everyone's after the net greatest points, and the points mean kill the capital ships, kill the carriers. When you're in wartime, you don't care, and then destroyers become a target, and suddenly not having the ability to engage aircraft once they get very close with your heavier guns, that really puts a flaw in your naval air defense plan, which is what I'm going to be discussing in the next bit of video from Haida, or in her bridge, where you can see me and Dr. Dan at this point. I am sitting in a position which is actually had been sat in quite a lot. This one position I find lots of pictures of various naval officers on tribals sitting, and it's there. And one of the first things I did when I was up there was like, do you mind if I... And once I told them the story and the history behind it and the number of pictures I'd found of various officers, including Vian sitting in that position while watching his ship, it suddenly became a thing that everyone wanted to be pictured sitting there. But I got to go first. And thank you again to everyone who made that possible. But now to the video from the bridge. So, let's see. So I am in Vian's spot, and pretty much every tribal captain's spot. They have sat themselves in this position on the bridge because you have such a good view around you. And it really is a very, very good spot for seeing everything. And it's absolutely wonderful. Now, it's kind of a bit of a thing to be sitting where a hero at the finest up. But this is a very cool ship. Haida is a wonderful ship, and it's it's a wonderful position to be sitting. The reason that is you can see all the bridge around you and what they're going on navigating wise. You can watch down the side of your ship and see what the state of the water is, the state of the sea. You can watch your guns, you can watch your whole ship, you can check your signal flags. It's an absolutely brilliant position, but it highlights the key point about being a destroyer commander. The fact is, you had to stay observant. You had to always be able to see what was going on around you. Because even when radar comes in, that's lovely, but it doesn't replace the Mark 1 eyeball. Because for a destroyer captain, what can I see is the critical thing. Can I see an aircraft coming in? Can I see all these things? Because I need to maneuver my ship. Good example again is Philip Vian, when he had dive bombers coming down on his ship. He had to pick whether he turned to port or turned to starboard to try and avoid the bombs. And if he got it right, that's great, the ship survives. Gets it wrong, he loses the ship. And that is one of the reasons why it's so open. One of the reasons why you can see so much around you. Because they're doing that. Because they need the visibility to do their jobs. There's always a question when people talk to me about open bridges. It's usually a case of, well, why aren't they protected? I hope that little video explains something. They have a reason for being without. When your primary weapon system is the Mark 1 eyeball, when that is your primary sensor for targeting, and your extra spatial is the Mark 1 eardrum, can you hear the enemy? Can you see the enemy? Then you can target them. Well, being open to the elements is a small price to pay for being able to fight what you can see and hear. Of course, Vian dodged several times from that platform, as did many other captains. One time he failed. One time he dodged wrong. And that led to the loss of his ship. HMS Afridi. Afridi was a proud ship for the Royal Navy. It was a very capable vessel. It had been laid down on the 9th of June 1936, launched on the 8th of June 1937, so 1 year less 1 day, and completed on the 28th and 9th of April 1938, to be commissioned on the 3rd of May 1938. It's not exactly a slow build. It's from laying down to commissioning less than 2 years. By over a month, less than 2 years. It would be sunk by aircraft, by air attack, on the 3rd of May 1940. As said, they went the wrong way. Dodged to port, dodged to starboard. Which way do you think the sticker bombs are going? And dodge. Which way do you think the aircraft is going? When the bombs start falling, then it's too late. So you have to watch the aircraft that is coming up and start to make the decision. Shout those orders. Down. There's a discussion you're going to see in a video in a second with me and Peter Dixon, who is an absolutely wonderful, he interjects, and he is absolutely a wonderful historian. He is one of the keepers of HMCS Haida, and honestly, being shown around, given a personal tour of Haida by him was definitely one of the highlights of the days I spent aboard her. And if you see him wandering around Haida, shake his hand and tell him he's great, because he deserves all the praise he can have. So the debate was basically navigator giving orders to the person manning the wheel, in the wheelhouse, and the point was, usually, if it's not under normal circumstances, if you're just doing normal sailing around, it's going to go navigator, officer of the watch. Officer of watch gives the orders. And back. Sometimes, because destroyers are often short of crew and war makes interesting times, you will find the officer of the watch is also the navigator. But also, sometimes you'll have a scenario where someone other than the officer of the watch will shout those orders down there. It might be the captain, it might be the navigator on the captain's instruction, if the captain is sitting on the bridge. Why? Because they might have the officer of the watch doing something else. They might also be in the middle of action. She had an interesting career. She served before war began. She's one of the 7 destroyers authorised under the 1935 Naval Estimates. And she's the 2nd ship of their name to serve in the Royal Navy. She's ordered to be constructed by Vickers Armstrong, and so is constructed at Walker, High Walker, their shipyard in Newcastle upon Tyne. She cost £341,462, which today would buy Not a small house. Not a massive house either. After commissioning in May, she was assigned to the first tribal destroyer flotilla, which, as I've talked about before, was the Mediterranean's destroyer flotilla, and would eventually go on to become the fourth destroyer flotilla. But the Royal Navy, to signify their difference, started off by calling them tribal destroyer flotillas, or TDFs, or occasionally tribal flotillas, or just TFs. Depends on who you're talking about. She went to the Mediterranean, took part in the arms embargo on the Spanish Civil War, and then by August was hosting Rear Admiral John Tovey, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet's destroyers at the time. More famous for what he gets up to later. With him aboard, they took part in the exercise in the Ionian Sea. Basically, Tovey was taking a look at his new instrument and trying to work out just how finely balanced this blade was. In September, she, along with her sister Cossack, and the Candy-class heavy cruiser, Devonshire, wandered into the Aegean Sea before continuing to Turkey for a formal visit there. They were part of the force which was going around with Warspite and a certain Admiral Cunningham, trying to make sure the Turks didn't get the idea to interfere in what might be coming, and that their previous Ottomans had done so. She then sailed for Alexandria, and then joined the rest of the tribals in Malta, where Captain Creswell assumed his role, finally, as captain of the flotilla, and in flotilla commander. And that's when Freedy becomes a flotilla leader. Creswell is the naval officer who precedes Vian in command of this flotilla. In March 1939, she collides with Penelope, the Arethusa class light cruiser, off Palma de Mallorca, Balearic Islands, always fun to visit. During the transfer of mail, she ended up having to return to Malta for repairs. When Italy invaded Albania on 7th April, the Mediterranean fleet was mobilised and remained on a war footing for the whole of May. At this point is when 1st Tribal Destroyer Flotilla is redesignated as 4th Destroyer Flotilla. Later in July, well, tensions were pretty high, and so Glorious goes to visit Athens and Greece. Mainly Athens, but does a bit of wandering around the rest of Greece as well, but mainly Athens, which of course is the capital of Greece, but there is more detail about her visit to Athens than the rest of Greece, where she wanders up and down off the coast. And she wanders up and down off the coast with some escorts. The escorts are Afridi, Gurkha, Mohawk, and Sikh, i.e. half of 4th Destroyer Flotilla. Fairly decent escort for a carrier. But also, this is the interesting thing, pre-war, that would be pretty normal, and there's usually also cruisers hanging around as well, which does show again how the end of Glorious is quite so strange. When you think, pre-war, during peacetime, she'd have 4 destroyers and a light cruiser as her escort. In wartime, for some reason, her captain is happy for her to be sailing around with just a couple of destroyers in a war zone. Afridi would, of course, start World War II in the Red Sea, where she was there to watch the Italians and try and deal with any surface raiders which got there. But now, let's move on to another of the A's. Arunta. Now, Arunta, her battle honours include the Pacific, New Guinea, Leyte Gulf, Lingian Gulf, and Borneo. And she'd be sold for scrap in 1968, sinking whilst under tow in 1969. Probably didn't like to go that way. Her motto was conquer or die. And she was one of the 3 destroyers built at the Cockatoo Docks and Engineering Company in Australia. She is an Australian tribal. She also displaced 1,990 tons at launch and 2,122 tons by her 1945 refit. So yes, 1,850 tons. Remember? That's the limit for these destroyers. She was laid down in November 1939, so after World War II had begun. Launched, depending on your perspectives, on either the 30th of November or the 1st of December 1940. Commissioned on the 30th of March 1942, and as I said, decommissioned 1956. Well, no, scrapped in 1968. 1956 is when she's decommissioned and technically sits around in ordinary for a while. Operation Reserve, as it was called by that point. She is named for the Arrente Aboriginal peoples, and while she initially started as a convoy escort and patrol ship, she then took on shore bombardment and amphibious landing support roles while attached to the 7th Fleet of the USN. She was responsible for sinking Row 33 off Port Moresby on the 24th of August 1942. And after World War II was over, she underwent 2 deployments to Japan as part of the British Commonwealth Occupation Force. She was modernised 1949 to 1952 to be reclassified as an anti-submarine destroyer. Appropriate, considering her credited kill is the Japanese submarine. However, after conversion, she then goes to serve in the Korean War and has fun when she's one of the first Australian warships assigned to the Far East Strategic Reserve, which was a British Commonwealth project created in the 1950s. It was based in Malaya, and it was supposed to be a forward defence point for Australia, New Zealand, and also other Commonwealth nations. Basically, the idea was you set up this force, you hopefully stopped any threats coming towards them from the north. Now, at this point, in the 1950s, Japan's gone. So what's the threat they're looking at? Well, of course, it's the Soviet Union. Arunta was actually built, I should point out, in the, if we quickly go back, in the form with 6 4.7-inch guns and a twin and 2 4-inch guns all in twin mounts. So she's built in the form which Royal Navy tribals are adapted to give her the air defence, because again, that gun in X mount can go high angle and can provide the fire. And it's about the air defence of the fleet, and how they planned it was to be engaging at long range with heavy weapons and causing as much disruption to your attacking forces with those heavy weapons as possible. Maybe you take them out, maybe you don't. Doesn't really matter. What matters is that you are actually engaging them at range, and you're breaking up their formation. And the more you break up an air attack's formation, the stronger you make your own defences, and the less likely they actually get to hit. This is one of the reasons why missiles require a completely different form of threat management than aircraft. Aircraft, if you break them up because you scare the squidgy organic bit in them flying them, then they become less effective. Missiles, they don't have a squidgy organic bit that feels fear. They just are doing processing of their target and taking aim. It's the way of the world. Then we have Asante. Asante is... honestly one of my favorite tribals. Honestly, there are some I get very, very biased towards. She's the only ship which gets to visit, of the tribals, gets to visit her tribal people she's named for, and they go all out to welcome this ship. I mean, they do everything they can. I've got a whole section on it in my book, because it's a... when I started talking about it and talking about the story, and someone came up and didn't hear me, and I was like, "Oh, so you're talking about HMS New Zealand and her experience?" No, I said I'm talking about HMS Asante. And I went, but that's New Zealand's story. No, it also happened to Asante. And that's the thing. There is some discussion of her motto. It's occasionally disputed, but broadly speaking, the odds are, if she followed the tribal practice of the rest of the class, she would probably have taken it from the Asante's own motto, which would be Come Apim Peba, which I am mispronouncing horribly because I am really, really bad at the Asante language, so please note that. Basically translates as kill 1,000 and 1,000 will come. Its other phraseology could be Wo kum apim apim be ba. I think it's the symbol for a click. I'm not 100% sure though. So, and I can't do that. So, I'm probably mangling it terribly, and I do apologize. But no, she has a very good career, and she survives World War II. She scrapped in 1949. She really didn't deserve it. One of her things, though, in her career, though, is she does have all this wonderful career dual things, but she also is one of the biggest sufferers of turbinitis for the entirety of the war. And the reason for that is, and they did sort of work it out, they basically ran these ships at full power the entire time. And the turbine blades designed for the tribals were good destroyer turbines. But of course, the tribals were slightly larger than the average British destroyer. And the first generation of these turbines, which are what are fitted for the tribals, are not quite yet fully modified. And you find the same turbine goes and gets fitted into later larger destroyers, and that's great. And people go, well, it's something problematic with the tribals. And basically, it's the first generation of turbines. They have issues. And honestly, again, as time goes on, some of those ships have their turbines replaced, and suddenly the issues go away. Turbinitis. It's an infectious disease. And then we've got HMCS Haida. Right, so originally this vessel was going to be the Iroquois. Then she becomes the Athabascan number 1 because this is the first of 3 tribals which were 3 Canadian vessels which have borne this name. 2 of them tribal class destroyers of this generation, because this vessel, sadly enough, also gets sunk. And I have to admit, one of the things I was really glad about meeting Peter Dixon about and discussing with him, it validated my view. I didn't ask him a question, etc. But when I did the Tribal Battles and Darings book, original plan had been to cover Canadian and Australian ships. But original plan had been pre-COVID, and I'd been planning to go out and visit the archives. And I'm listening to the stories of him, and I'm going, I'm so glad I didn't. Because I wouldn't have had any of idea of these stories from the books that are available in the UK. I wouldn't have had any idea of these stories, and if I hadn't come out and talked to you, had seen the primary information you've given. So someday perhaps I will write another version of that book and put in the Canadian and the Australian histories. But I will do that, and I will go and visit their archives
before I do so I can have it properly put in. This vessel, I know quite a bit about its story because it features so much in the Royal Navy archives, in the British archives in Kew, because it spends most of its life on this side of the Atlantic fighting for the British. It is actually built at Vickers Armstrong, again the High Walker Yard in Newcastle on Tyne, and its motto was "We fight as one." It got the Arctic 1943-4 honours and the English Channel 1944. It actually did get to serve in 10th Destroyer Flotilla. Unfortunately, it got sunk on 29th of April 1944. She was patrolling alongside Haida in support of a British mine-laying operation off the coast of France, near the mouth of the Mola River. There were some orders, which would come about later, quite common, for the 10th Flotilla vessels to intercept some German warships near the Ile de Basse. This is not the later battle of the Ile de Basse, this is an earlier thing. Those vessels have been spotted by Coastal Radar, that was positioned in southern England. During the engagement, Athabaskan was actually torpedoed and sunk, with 128 men lost, 44 rescued by Haida, and 83 taken prisoner by 3 German minesweepers that sorted from the coast after Haida departed. There is a dispute about exactly what happened, whether she was hit by shore gunner battery fire, whether she was hit but then by a torpedo, or whether at least a second torpedo hit. The official history of the Royal Canadian Navy attributes the second explosion to fires touching off the ammunition magazine, which is not impossible. Let's be honest, destroyers do not have armour, not like larger ships do. She was definitely torpedoed by T-24, a German torpedo boat, which we taken out later in the war. And her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander John Stubbs, was killed in action. He declined rescue by Haida to swim back for more crew members, and never seen again. The bridge. So, there, as mentioned before, there are going to be a couple of videos after this. There's going to be one which introduces you to the ship badge of Haida and has a whole discussion from Peter Dixon. And then there's going to be another little video which is me in the wheelhouse, having a look around and basically enjoying myself, and try to explain some of the points from there. But the important thing is to remember, up here is where the navigator, officer of the watch, and all the other people who are making decisions about where the ship's going will be. Up here on the bridge.
This is HMCS Haida's official ship's badge, which was 1948. And the badge Haida is named after the Haida tribe on the west coast of Canada, the Queen Charlotte Islands, and the folklore of the Haida nation is of a Thunder River bird, and that the flapping of the Thunder River bird's wings causes the thunder, and the flashing of its eyes, the lightning. So Haida's badge is of a two-headed thunderbird to symbol all-around view, 360-degree views, with its wings outstretched to show that Haida's guns thundered across the seas.
So, this is the most important spot in the ship, and possibly, arguably, the most important single-person spot. Now, the reason I say it's the most important single-person is because this is where the ship is steered from, but I'm going to show you something which is going to interest you. If we flick around, you're going to notice I can't see where I'm going. There's a porthole there, which is closed in action. Another porthole there, which is closed in action. And this thing above here
which if I point up, is a sort of more recent modification to allow people to see down in here. Now, the reason for this place being quite so, how do I put this, sealed off is because it needs to be protected. It also needs to be made of brass so that that magnetic compass doesn't get affected, and because whilst this is where the ship is steered from, this is not where the ship is navigated from. That's the navigator up there, up above.
The officer of the watch.
And the officer of the watch. Well, I'm being correct, very nicely corrected, and I will point out by a very nice try by the official historian of Haida, who is very lovely. And yes, it was usually the officer of the watch giving the orders. Sometimes the navigator would be acting as officer of the watch. Sometimes they'd be relaying instructions to the officer of the watch, basically about where they were supposed to be going. But the reason for that was because you might be able to see what's in front of you, but that's not the important thing for a ship. What's important for a ship is what's underneath the water in front of you, and you can't see that. Sometimes the rocks are buried, so there's no point you being actually able to see. The navigators, you looking at all their charts, checking all their bearings, and hopefully, if they've done it right and put the chart right, the officer of the watch has the right instructions, you take it right. If things go wrong, well, then you can't really be blamed because you weren't the one looking in the direction, were you?
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I don't know. Now, to HMCS Athabaskan number 2. I need Iron Brew to go for all this. Athabaskan number 2 was ordered in April 1942. She was not going to be Athabaskan. There was already a vessel called Athabaskan. However, Athabaskan died. She got sunk. And the Canadian Navy decided, rather like the British decided with Gurkha, that this was not a name you wanted going away. This was a name you wanted. This was a name that already had laurels, that had people who supported it, and "We Fight as One" as a good, friggin' good motto. In fact, honestly, you couldn't have had a finer looking ship if you tried. In 1949, this was after World War II, because she wasn't commissioned until 1948. She's launched in 1946, laid down officially in 1943, but it's not commissioned until 1948. In 1949, February, she'd only been commissioned in January 1948, she has a mutiny. She's fueling in Mexico. 90 sailors, about half the ship's company, locked themselves in the mess decks and refused to come out until getting the captain to hear their grievances. The captain was very clever while dealing with it. He entered the mess deck under the grounds of it being an informal discussion of sailors' grievances, avoided using the term mutiny, which had legal consequences, and placed his cap over the written list of demands so that he didn't see any legal evidence of mutiny. There were similar incidents taking place on Crescent at Nanjing, China, Magnificent in the Caribbean, and thankfully, again, the Canadian Royal Navy's captains were very smart and very capable and knew how to handle the issue, and they handled it with sensitivity. What's interesting is we talk about the mutiny of the Royal Navy had in the 1930s. The various issues the Royal Navy had in the 1920s and 1930s, they had some issues with mutinies as well. you don't really hear about the half of it, because the vast majority of ships, captains dealt with the issues much like these Canadian officers dealt with them. Sensitively and very carefully. So they're not actually considered mutinies by the Royal Navy, and they don't make the press, and things get sorted out. The issues included lack of rum rations and all sorts of pay issues. These are legitimate concerns. I would have to say in some of the Royal Navy ships, it does seem that the captains knew what was coming very quickly. There is one example. It's not quite the same in the Canadian vessels in the 1940s, late 1940s, but in the 1930s there is certainly one example of a destroyer captain who, while the crew were having a discussion of their upsets, walked in a state of what would be called undress, because wasn't wearing his epaulets, wasn't wearing anything, just a shirt, trousers, walked in, sat down on the table and said, "Oh, we've been having a hard time. How are you having? How are you doing?" Probably tipped off by his own steward. More than likely. Tipped off by his steward. They would explain it. And so he was able to pop in and go, "What is the problem?" And that is a very important thing to be able to do. If a captain can do that, if a captain can pop in and deal with an issue before it becomes an issue, that captain will go far. I would love to say all captains were so skilled, but sadly they weren't. Sadly, they were not. And that's usually just a scenario where you end up with the big things which make the news and everyone starts talking about the Navy having issues. And they are right. The Navy does have issues. You can't strike in the armed forces. You don't have a union. You have divisions in the Royal Navy and most of the Commonwealth navies which have succeeded it. You have various methods of getting your grievances heard. But the trouble is, you are operating a very powerful, very important weapon system. And that's one of the reasons why you have the legal restrictions on what you can do to demonstrate that you do. But still, Afghanistan handled with very, very great care and very great skill. And she has an interesting career. She not only gets career as a battle honour, but she actually is not decommissioned till 1966 and sold for scrapping in 1969. Bataan. Now, of course, this ship is famous because it's the only tribal class destroyer not named for a tribe. No. Instead, it's named for a battle because, well, how do I put this? General MacArthur has a very single-tracked mind. It was originally to be named Chingili, then Kurnai, after the Kurnai or Gunai Aborigines, and then it changed to Bataan to honour the stand by US troops during the Battle of Bataan. It also helps reciprocate the decision to name a cruiser, the USS Canberra, in honour of the HMAS Canberra that was lost at the Battle of South Island, which itself stops Shropshire being renamed Canberra when it's given to the Australians. Everything has consequences and a list. She was laid down in February 1942, launched January 1944, commissioned May 1945, is at one point pictured operating alongside USS Bataan, which must have been an interesting scenario, although I haven't actually got the picture. I've just heard about it, and I think I've seen it in a book a couple of times, but haven't actually got it. I think that picture might have been taken slightly later, as she doesn't really arrive in the combat area till after the official Japanese surrender. Then she takes part in the Korean War and is decommissioned in 1954, sold for scrap 1957. And honestly, that's probably the Daring class fault, because the Australians now have access to the successor to the successor to the Tribals. And it's good. It's very good. It's very pretty as well. Not quite as pretty as a Tribal in some regards. I think the Tribal's proportions just are... but still very, very pretty. But Bataan had a good service and was a critical part of Australian capabilities in the Korean War. It's a land war, but the naval contributions really do matter. And Bedouin. Oh, Bedouin. She is sunk, of course, in June 1942 in the Mediterranean. A rather sad end for her, but this is her in Iceland. She gets around. She really does. There is a debate, as always with all these ships, as to whether or not the Tribals were designed to be anti-submarine ships. They were designed to have anti-submarine warfare capabilities so they could backfill ships which were primarily anti-submarine warfare vessels. That's the thing. They were supposed to... Their guns, really the whole idea of having the twin 4.7s was they were supposed to, under pre-war exercises, had proved significantly capable anti-aircraft weapons, and so therefore they will do fine to give them the anti-aircraft capability. The quadruple 21-inch torpedoes, well, that's going to make anything bigger than a destroyer, slightly worried. But they got ASDIC, they had got a depth charge rack, 2 throwers for self-defense, 2 throwers, and, although not all throwers, man, and theoretically 30 depth charges, but again, it's kind of like torpedoes, and I'll be talking about them in a bit. When you start to look around the ship and you start to talk, and even in this sort of picture, if you look very carefully at a torpedo rack, you can sort of see spaces where there looks to be some interesting things on the deck. And the idea, whilst they should carry this and have official stowage for this, and then you have ready stowage, and you have the official storage base and those things. Well, with 2 throwers and a rack, let's say you let 3 off the rack, you discharge the thrower twice in a spread, that's put out 7 torpedoes. 7 depth charges, sorry. Well, you can only do that 4 times if you're only carrying 30. But even if you say it's just a single one, and a single one from the rack, and a single one from each thrower, so inputting 3, that's 10 times. You can launch a pattern. But they did manage to hunt down a fair number of submarines in their time as well, for destroyers which weren't supposed to be anti-submarine vessels, and assisted in a lot more, and sometimes seem to have dropped a lot of depth charges if they were cycling off. Well, if they're cycling off in threes, the fact that they then say they dispelled all the depth charges in 5 goes would suggest that they are firing a lot more than 3, so at least 6. And then the requests for more afterwards wouldn't also make sense. But we'll leave that to one side. Those are the official figures, and that is often what you have to go with as a historian. And that's often what you have to write down. And I talk about this through with many historians when writing this book on the tribals. One of the most frustrating things was some of the things I know from putting together, reading accounts in several sources. I don't think it's quite as it goes officially, but I can't find a source which actually says that I can point to. I'm inferring from several sources put together in my mind. Like a jigsaw piece. I've got the official picture of the jigsaw that's on the box. And I've got all the pieces sort of around an edge, and I can infer what the piece in the middle is going to say. But it looks slightly different than the box. Not much. Let's be honest, perhaps the box is just a very nice picture, and then there's detail on the actual jigsaw that doesn't quite show through the box's painting. And that's more sort of what I'm saying, but I can't find that piece. Cayuga. Bedouin made it through the Norway campaign. It's the Mediterranean where she gets lost. She's hit by 12 6-inch rounds and has many near misses and an aerial torpedo before sinking during Operation Harpoon. In contrast, Cayuga, HMCS Cayuga, she has... well, she's one of the post-World War II completed tribal destroyers. Because she's laid down October 1943 in Halifax. She's launched July 1945, commissioned October 1947, and finally decommissioned February 1964. Ona oa den doa. Now let us proceed. She's a beautiful looking ship. She really is. Name for the Cayuga people. Again, hopefully I'm pronouncing them correctly. She served 3 tours in Korea. She was part of the initial first dispatch of vessels sent by Canada, departing Eskimo on the 5th of July 1950. In 1952, she was reconstructed as a destroyer escort, given the new hull number 218. So this is after a conversion. As you can see, twin 4-inch guns forward, 3-inch gun aft, if I'm not mistaken. And all sorts of other things added on, which we'll be getting into later. She, during her time, has quite an interesting career. She has the Royal Canadian Sea Cadet Corps at Exeter, named after her. And, well, her initial group, when she serves as a training ship and being assigned to the 2nd Canadian Escort Squadron, is Commander Henry Davison, who's her captain. In November 1955, the 2nd Canadian Escort Squadron was sent to take part in the largest naval exercises that had taken place since the Second World War, and these were off the coast of California. This was when NATO was really starting out, and when large exercises were starting to become a thing. You have to remember NATO in 1949, formed in 1949, had been going 6 years by this point, but it takes a while to get the process in place and start to develop these the plans for these huge exercises, which they really want to do because they're a great way of holding everyone together. And the Canadian tribals are a key part of the force that does hold it together. Their tribals might no longer be in service in the Royal Navy by this point, but their service with Canada is something which should not be forgotten, and without them, the Canadian Navy would have been far more porous in its capabilities. Now, torpedoes. I was having an interesting conversation with these, with several of the volunteers who had served aboard tribals, etc. Not in, of course, wartime. But one of the things we started, and this is, please note, again, Dr. Dan is providing the ability to give you an idea of the dimensions. He is a slightly above average height gentleman. Very helpful here. For you to, perspective-wise. One of the things I noticed about the torpedoes and their positioning is there are lots of spaces and anchor points already built into the design along the hull nearby. And if I was a captain who I knew was who was a captain I knew I was going off where I might be fighting a long-running battle of a surface engagement, kind of like in the Mediterranean, I think by hook or by chief, I could probably find it within my heart to find space for more of these torpedoes. As I've discussed before, there isn't really a defined space, but there are certainly spaces where they can officially be positioned as part of the loading process. And there are all the facilities aboard already to load those torpedoes. It's just that theoretically they don't carry spares. So you have all the processes, you have all the people, you have all the things you need to do it. So I have to say my visit to her definitely to Haida definitely confirmed my view that if I could find a document or anything which gave me anything firm other than they launched this many torpedo attacks, they launched this, it doesn't add up if they've just got 4 torpedoes. It doesn't add up. You don't launch torpedoes singly, and even then, if you're carrying 4 torpedoes and you launch 5 attacks with them, that seems a bit. Where are the other things coming from? But there are spaces, and again, it's one of those things. I doubt a captain would not, if given the options. So, we have been in, before to go to the next video from the ship, we have been in the wheelhouse, been at this point where they were actually controlling the rudder from. Now we're going to go into the rooms behind that. Those are the plotting rooms. They're the submarine hunting rooms. They also include the systems which would later on be used to fire the squids, as well as fire the depth charges, because they'd be fired remotely based on the information they're receiving from the Aztec. So we're going to be talking about that. Of course, the squid comes from is fitted far later. It's part of their destroyer escort conversion, which happens post World War II. And let's be honest, if the squid system or any system like that had been available in 1936 and had actually been available for service, you can guarantee the tribals were being fitted with it, because it'd be an easy way to both upgrade their anti-submarine warfare capability and also upgrade their ability to help the rest of the fleet. Hope you're going to enjoy the videos. Peter Dixon is again with me, and these were the videos, some of them are taken from during our tour, where he's going around and it's just him and me chatting as we're going around. He has a massively amazing font of information. Right.
One of the guys come back from Britain, training program. So that was around, they put him up for a flight. And he was teasing him, well, how good were you guys this week? I forgot that was some kind of. Well, I appreciate it. I'm just going to peek my head around the corner and get out of their way.
Do you want to see the coolest space in the ship?
Yes, because 20 years.
Go through here, and this is your there's your firing bar. That's your intercept. When the bar comes to the pin, that's when your squids go off. Okay, that's the contact. The squids are actually fired from here. They're not fired in the squid handling room or back there.
There's no point having them fired from there because they have no information to fire, do they?
So yeah, these are World War II ASDICs.
147F was the one that was in, and range recorder and depth recorders.
See, when the ship decommissioned in '63, they had all the equipment. They just ripped it out. You can see the wires. They just cut the wires. Okay, actually, just behind us here is the Mark 63 fire control compartment for beacon, and there's like nothing. They just cut the wires. They pulled the stuff out. There's like nothing in there to try because the stuff was still being used in '63. So this again is conversion. This was the chart house.
Yeah.
This was expanded in the 60s because in 62 and 63 the ship was used as a naval reserve training ship. So they're training naval officers, one of whom is up on the bridge, Neil Bell. Right. So this chart room was expanded. So it's but it's still very useful. But then we'll go over here. This is your Admiralty Research Laboratories plotting table.
Yeah.
And this is Tribal 44. This is it. Okay. There's your screen down here that throws up on the graticule onto the paper here. Okay. There's a tracing paper here. So the graticule is projected onto here. So here's your plot. Okay. So this is your plotting table here. Okay. So this is when they talked about the plot and putting it in to get the submarine and the core rest inhabit, this is your plotting table. So this is your plotting table here. So Harry makes a remark too that he was close by like this, so whenever anything's happening, just step into the ops room and you can see the plot, and again your PPI was in here as well. So there's your plot. This was I'm not sure, I can't remember this one, John. This is a Post and Sperry plotting table.
Yeah.
It's not conducive to Haida, but it's I think we acquired it, but it's not. This is not original to Haida. 63. I don't know when they got this. Not when I was in. So we have Sperry's, but again, this is the operations room, or the CIC as Americans call it. Actually, there it is here. There was your fire, your graticule there, the screen.
Long time way back.
Yeah. So anyway, here's your plot anyway. So
Yeah.
These radars are again post-war Sperry. This is your spot 4, and up at the bridge you have that for any collision.
Theory of torpedoes. It's an interesting thing to come back to, but let's move on with the tribal class destroyers. HMS Cossack, of course, and you might have noticed, and I think I might have already mentioned, I'm going in alphabetical order rather than year of service entry date or anything like that. I just felt like going in alphabetical order because it mixes up the Canadian, the Australian, the British ships in a nice way if you go in alphabetical order. Ah, Cossack. See, she wasn't the flotilla leader, that was Afridi. Cossack took over as flotilla leader whenever Afridi was busy, and basically Vian decided Sherbrooke needed a break. Which is why Cossack is the tribal class destroyer which Vian takes into to the alt mark, to sort of into the fjord to get the alt mark. And that's just a cool thing. These ships are just... they have so much history, but this ship especially does. It will be sunk by U-563 on the 27th of October 1941. It's sunk by a submarine. But before that, it had taken part in the Chase of Bismarck, and of course been one of the destroyers which, well, the destroyer which Vienne led the boxing in of Bismarck from, because by this point he's lost a Friede. It's taken part in the Second Battle of Narvik, under Sherbrooke. And of course, as mentioned, Jossingford. These are 3 very big, high-profile events that it takes part in. She had been completed on the 10th of June 1938 and commissioned on the 14th of June. She cost £341,082, excluding weapons and communications outfits which were furnished by the Admiralty from a separate budget. Always be prepared. Buying ships and purchase of ships is never a straightforward sum. Whenever someone quotes a figure to you and goes, I'm sure this is how much this ship costs, look at them and go, and you check the accounts. It's the same with all military equipment. It's almost always some other cost hidden somewhere. And yet, she's escorting a convoy from Gibraltar back to the UK when she's struck by a single torpedo. She's taken in tow, but the weather worsens, the tow slips, and she sinks in the Atlantic west of Gibraltar on 27th of October 1941. The ship's cat, Oscar, survived. Oscar had also survived the sinking of the Bismarck, and would go on to survive the sinking of HMS Ark Royal, after she's torpedoed in November 1941, at which point they put Oscar on land duty because everyone's slightly worried that this cat's 9 lives are coming to an end, and they're not quite sure whether it's necessarily conducive to them. I would add, ship's cats though are a theme, and you should keep watching this video because at some point we are going to be looking at Haida's ship cat. We actually meet up with Haida's ship cat aboard the ship. Aboard Haida. And here is Eskimo in her normal form. As said at the beginning of this video, she's an amazing ship. It's an amazing story to think about her, think about how much she lost. And in many of the videos when I was doing lives from Haida, I was asking people, you know, where did she lose her bow? And you have to go back to where you see the superstructure of the come down. And that's where there is a natural, in the design, break in the hull. That is where there is a bulkhead. Watertight bulkhead. And everything from that point forward goes. It's not a small part of the bow that goes. It's not a little bit. It's a huge chunk of the ship. But she does more than that. Eskimo survives World War II. She loses her bow again. She is one of those vessels which just keeps going back for more and more. And the fact that she's used as a target ship in the Gerlach before she's sold for scrap on the 27th of June 1949 is frankly, I consider something akin to blasphemy. I honestly do. I understand why ships were. I know the reason for it, and there's no ship you can make a good case for, yes, should use this vessel for target practice. But she had participated in the Second Battle of Narvik, as mentioned, and I'll talk about that more in a second, where she loses her bow. But she has to return to Vickers Armstrong at Newcastle, the place where she was built, to be rebuilt. That's where they go and give her a new bow. And then she goes and supports Allied landings in North Africa. By the way, she's not out of the war for years. She's not an HMS Belfast. She loses her bow in April 1940. She's back in service by September 1940. This is after they've tried to do temporary repairs and they've actually removed the B mount because that was, you know, to try and reduce the weight and the stress on this end of the hull. And you can see it's actually slightly back from that forward position, but you can see where the forward structure goes. It's tremendous to think about, but it's also to realise the sheer power of a torpedo, but also the fragility of these very powerful looking ships. One of the things, again, you'll realise when we're sort of walking around, I'll be talking about this when I'm showing the video of the engineering spaces and walking through the engine room. I tried very much to give you a person's route through the engine room and what it's like, and the things you see as you're walking around. The hull, you can literally see the hull and the waters the other side of that. Not just on the side of the ship, but the bottom of the ship. You can look down and you know that that piece of metal, there is nothing below that metal other than water. And the engineering spaces are huge spaces. You get a hit there, you're going to have humongous trouble. This is a ship which goes on to be a vital part of 10th Destroyer Flotilla, protecting the D-Day landing forces. She is... well, her and Huron decide to go and take on Volbostenboot, V203 Karlova, V203 Class Bolton, and a minesweeper in English Channel on the 13th of July 1944. Eskimo managed to get a bit damaged, but then she goes out to the Far East. She has literally lost a bow. She's been damaged again. Later on in the war, she has more damage done to her bow, and she has to get it replaced again. Takes less time that second time. I'm so tempted to make a nose job joke, but I'm not going to. But she goes back, and she's operating again in the Far East. She fought in the Mediterranean. She fought, well, during Operation Husky. She fought in Norway. She did Arctic convoys, Atlantic convoys, Biscay convoys. She did the Far East and the Mediterranean. She did everywhere in World War II. She lost her bow fully to a torpedo once, damaged other times. It depends on how you count it, whether it becomes one or two more. And yet, she uses target practice. It's the historian in me, I know. And it's because I'm passionate about these ships and I love them. Their history, all the work their crews do, but some of the things that happened to them after World War II just beggars belief. And then we have HMS Gurkha here. Gurkha has those 4.7-inch guns. They won't fix on the target. They won't do what she's supposed to do. she can't engage the aircraft coming in, attacking her convoy, attacking the convoy. And so they go to operate independently. And moves away. Moves away from the convoy, from her sister ships, from other ships to protect her, to try and get a better angle in the aircraft. Draws them off, engages them. But it really adds fuel to the fire of the decision-making process, not even just in the 1930s, but in the 1920s, when these sort of guns are being developed, and sort of early 1930s when they're first being considering. Yes, they're working on the 4.5-inch dual purpose, and that's coming through, but the fact is, no one seems to have thought when they're making their pre-war assumptions. And you can perhaps blame this on the idea of a Far Eastern war being a central tenet of British planning. The idea of protecting ships other than capital ships, and working to protect convoys from our attack, and therefore perhaps the destroyers being the most valuable warship in the convoy. I am so glad that ship was preserved. Seriously, yes, she has been mucked around within the 1950s. Yes, there have been things added onto her and changed her. She has those twin 4-inch guns, which are still very cool guns. Please, do not get me wrong. She joins the We Blew Up a Train Club, which is something which tribal class destroyers like to belong to with those guns. And I have got some videos talking through various gun positions that are coming up later. But they're not the 4.7s. They're not what she had originally. 3 twin 4.7-inch guns. And a twin 4-inch, given the wartime fit of the general purpose tribals, who had been given the weapons they had been to try and make them general purpose, and found those weapons weren't as general purpose as they hoped. And now we get to see them moving the foremount, and it's quite cool to see it still moving. There aren't many ships in this world of this age who still have moving gun mounts. There really aren't. I think if you went to HMS Belfast and you said, "I'd like to move the turrets around," they'd probably look at you a bit funny and go, "Really? You want to break us?" But Haida helped. Well, that was the thing. This conversion basically turned this ship into a more powerful anti-aircraft unit than even a C-class conversion AA cruiser.
This is the fuse setting machine.
Yeah.
Okay. The round comes up here, goes in here. The fuse setter sets it in here. We have a gun crew of 15 men in this gun crew. 15 men. As you can.
Oh yeah, I see that.
And we had an argument with one of our volunteers. This is a gun mounting.
Yes.
You know, mounting, the ammunition comes from outside the gun to the gun. The turret it comes up. It is not a turret. If you take this thing off the deck, there's 4 bolts that holds it onto the gun support.
Yeah.
It's in the mounting.
That I have to explain to people the reason why they went for a mount rather than a turret was because one of the treaty limits they couldn't get enough weight, so they could either give them a very thin turret which would turn into shrapnel when it's hit, or they could give them a mount which actually gave them some protection.
But people think when you see the picture of the 4.7 with that extended gun shield, it looks like a turret, but it's not.
No. It's basically the destroyer version of we're going to have this.
And this, I've seen only one reference to it, as far as I know this is getting, but this is called the psychological separator. And this was put in Korea. You won't find pictures of this in any RN gun screws, because it was put in Korea. Okay, what was happening was, when I go to load a gun or load right gun, left gun barrel goes off and comes back with great velocity back here. So I put the round in, okay?
Yeah.
So they put this in. I can't see what the other gun is doing. The rate of fire, the rate of loading went up like 80%.
Yeah.
Because the other wham steps out here, next guy wham. Okay? You can't see what the other gun's doing. But it's a real pain for maintenance to get your hand in there to get that breech block, get that nut out of here with the castle nut. Okay, get those cotter pins out of there is real fun with your greasy hands. So.
And well, if we're going to see a picture of her, we might as well do Haida. And I think this picture was taken a few years ago, because she's looking very spick and span. Could be just a different light. It could be just a different light. But I'm wondering if one's pre her being painted for the season and one's post her being painted for the season or something. Please notice again, she of course has the red maple leaf. You will notice that Sackville, when we're talking about her, had a green maple leaf, and that was because the original symbol was the green one, and it later on changed to the red maple leaf. I don't think Haida ever didn't have the red one. I'm not sure though. There is a debate on some of these things, and honestly, and I will say this to my Canadian viewers, I was honestly a little afraid to ask. It seemed like I'd already on Sackville had experienced the divisions it could cause, the question, and I didn't want to ask it on Haida. They were all very nice, and you don't want to make nice people upset, or of course possibly between very passionate people who care about it, a whole debate to go on that will outlast your arrival, and then all they remember is the debate you caused while you were there. You don't want to do that. Not when they're very, very nice and they've let you literally crawl all over the ship and given you a wonderful guided tour. Haida had an amazing career. She really did. She is laid down in September 1941, launched August 1942, commissioned August 1943, decommissioned for the first time in March 1946, recommissioned after a refit in March 1952, and would be finally decommissioned in October 1964. Her battle honours include the Arctic, the English Channel, Normandy, Biscay, and Korea. And she is the only surviving member of the tribal class. She is the sole representative left to remind us of the heroism of these 27 ships and their crews. Crews who served on these ships in not just a single wars, but multiple wars. Many of these ships went on to fight in wars far removed from that which they had originally been built for. They were built for projected war in World War II, which was supposed to be a battle in the Far East. Then it came closer. They had a potential war in the Mediterranean, potential war with Germany. They'd go on to fight a war that would be unlike what had been planned in its strategic, or its strategic, how do I put this, playing out, but to an extent similar to what had been envisaged in terms of the combat, and would then be called on to fight another war less than a decade later, half a decade later. And also to see in the Cold War. Her crew took part in the rescue of survivors from sinking HMCS Haida. I will try my best to get that ship's name correct, but I am always going to seem to be mucking it up. I don't know. She forced T-27 aground and set the vessel afire with shelling during the Battle of Ile-de-Basse. Ushant, depending on who you're talking to. She is one of the last survivors of, well, I think is potentially the last survivor of Canada's. It definitely is the last survivor, because I don't think Sackville was down for it. So it definitely is the last survivor of Canada's contribution Operation Downfall, which was the planned invasion of Japan. Her, along with Huron and Iroquois, were to be refitted for that role. She had a long career. And a good one. Now, her preservation, I'm going to quickly talk about that. Now, her preservation starts out kind of interesting, because she's actually preserved by a special organization, the Haida Incorporated, and various other groups try to keep her going. Eventually, in 2002, at the urging apparently of an MP, Sheila Copps, plus quite a lot of other provincial government and local persons, and I'm fairly sure also quite a lot of volunteers as well, she's purchased from the provincial government who had taken on ownership over by Parks Canada. And they then took her in for a $5 million refit to her hull. And that's how she's ended up at Hamilton. And she's been there ever since. She's a National Historic Site, and she is worthy of that. She really is. In February 2018, she was designated the ceremonial flagship of the Canadian Navy. And is, of course, behind her is HMCS Star, and they really do know the value of what they have. One of the things I find interesting about her is, of course, they've taken her propellers off, and they're sitting on the side. I see this a lot with preserved ships. They take their propellers off. And I know there are very good conservation reasons for why they do that, but I still secretly think it's because they don't want me to go and nick any of them. I wouldn't have taken her out for a long trip. I just wanted to see how she'd handle the open water. It wouldn't have been a long trip, but no. I'm fairly certain there were volunteers who would quite gladly have helped me. It would have been lovely to have taken her out for a trip, but no one was... I don't think Parks Canada would have been quite so keen on the idea. I think they'd have been very worried. Nutty British naval historian takes Haida out for joyride around the Great Lakes would not be a headline they'd want. Jail time versus the few moments of getting to drive her, take her around the lakes. We'll never know. No propellers. Huron, another of the Canadian vessels, and in many ways very much twinned with Haida. She decommissions in 1946, recommissions in 1950, and decommissioned again in 1963. She'd been laid down in 1941, launched June 1942, and commissioned July 1943. She has Arctic, English Channel, Normandy, Korea, again. She took part in so many things. And her X-turret, the twin 4-inch guns, live on at the Royal Military College of Canada. You will find them there. Post World War II, this is during the Korean War, she has some really interesting things. She's recommissioned for training purposes originally, then sent overseas, which is why she's one of the first to be recommissioned. And her, along with Afghanistan, which is of course number 2 Afghanistan, screened aircraft carriers on the east coast of Korea. Remember, aircraft carriers were critical to operations in Korea. Without them, you didn't have air support, because the air bases had been overrun. And again, you can sit there and go, well, we've got aircraft which have the range to operate from Japan or here and provide air support. You do, they have the range to reach there, but how long is the flight time going to be, there and back? How many aircraft are you going to need to maintain some aircraft on call over troops to provide combat air support? That's the problem. That's why you have the carriers. You can bring them so much closer. And the carrier comes as part of a battle group. Again, this is one of those scenarios where people often like to do these false things of, it's this system versus this system. Top trumps. Cute. But actually it's this combination of systems versus this combination of systems. And how does it all balance out in the end is where the interesting thing lies, and where the creativity of command comes in. How do you employ the assets you have available to you? Huron is used well. She takes part in shore bombardment, and also takes part in the Han River demonstration during HMS Glory and USS Sicily's airstrikes on North Korea. Upon her return to Canada, she goes for a major refit. This changes her. Why gun? Well, that gets taken away and replaced with a double squid anti-submarine mortar system, similar to what Haida now has on her aft. Her main guns became uniform, with the 4.7-inch guns being replaced with 4-inch guns forward. X-mount became a twin 3-inch 76mm 50 cal mount, which I have got a video with. And 4 single 40mm Bofor guns were fitted. She then went and did her second tour of duty as a Commonwealth Task Force member, and this lasted from June 1953 to February 1954. And then we have Iroquois. So we really have had a Canadian run. Iroquois is important to be the first tribal destroyer commissioned. How do I say this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the original Afghanistan was going to be called Iroquois, and the original Iroquois was going to be called Afghanistan, and they changed names around in order to make sure Iroquois is commissioned first. Why? Because it matters. She was the first ship to bear the Iroquois name, and the first ship of the class to serve with the Royal Canadian Navy, and this was considered important. And when I say this, what is considered important? Because of the importance of the Iroquois people as a First Nations, part of Canada. She would again get a very impressive list of battle honours. The Atlantic 1943, the Arctic 43-45, which to my mind means she, because you can literally not get to the Arctic without having gone through the Atlantic, probably did some stuff in the Atlantic in 44 and 45 as well. Biscay 43-44, Norway 45. Again, I'm fairly certain you'd have had to go through some section of the Atlantic to get to some parts of Norway, especially some of the parts they're operating in. And Korea, 1952-53. She's scrapped in 1966. She's decommissioned in 1962. She'd been recommissioned in October 1951. First decommissioned in February 1946. First commissioned on 30th November 1942. She'd been laid down 19th September 1940 and launched the 23rd of September 1941. And now we have another brave ship. We have a brave ship which actually I start my book off with discussing. I misspoke. I start off my book with Mashona. I knew there was a major quote about Maori in the book, though, and here it is. While escorting the convoys was a key role, it was in the cruiser role of surface sweep, the offensive counterpart to those sweeps carried up to secure convoy routes, that the tribal class contributed to the success of the Battle of Cape Bon in December 1941. Two of the number, Sikh and Maori, along with the Dutch ship Isaac Swears and another destroyer, the L-class Legion, sank two Italian light cruisers, which in design were similar to that preferred by the Italian Mediterranean Fleet's command during the pre-build tribal discussions, as examined in Chapter 1. Cape Bon was a battle which clearly showed both the capabilities of the Navy destroyer force as a whole and the tribal class in particular, as the following account demonstrates. And here we have Maori, Cape Bon. Commander Rafe Edward, Courage, Royal Navy. After your torpedoes and had damaged the leading cruiser, Maori opened fire with gunfire, and a large number of hits were observed on the bridge of the enemy. When she was abeam, Maori fired two torpedoes, one of which was seen to hit, the other was unobserved. The cruiser then passed astern in flames and was undoubtedly sinking. The second ship was lost sight of, but a sheet of flame was seen away to port, and it was presumed that she was sinking. One torpedo boat was seen and passed very close down Maori's starboard side. Fire from 4.7-inch guns was opened, but was not very successful owing to the very short range. Close-range weapons unfortunately jammed. I did not pursue this torpedo boat, as you made the signal to disengage. Battle of Cape Bon. That's a cool battle. And as said, it involves two Italian light cruisers that get sunk. Maori herself doesn't survive World War II. She's sunk by aircraft on 12 February 1942. And, well, she sunk at her moorings in Malta Grand Harbour, with the loss of one of her crew. This was a ship which had rescued some of the survivors from Bismarck after that vessel had sunk, which had escorted vessels through all sorts of campaigns, had been part of the vicious fighting in the North Sea and the Norwegian campaign. And she sunk at moorings in Malta Grand Harbour. Rather a sad end for a proud ship, but sadly enough, the weight of air attacks had just proved too great for the harbour's defences. Ah, the Canada Naval History crew. Right, so this was a really cool bunch to go with. We have Gareth, we have, of course, Drac, we have myself, and we have Dr. Dan. So we had our medical advice, we had our Tweeto, we had our inscrutable engineer, who always knew how to fix things, and we had comic relief, because basically that's what I'm going to declare myself, because anything else would sound like ego talking. But it was really, really fun, and really nice working on them. But now, what are we going back to? Well, if I'm not mistaken, and there is always a possibility I am mistaken, because let's be honest, this is me doing this. We were going back to have a look at the 1950s stuff and the adaptations of Haida for her 1950s role, including some of the stuff in the wardroom and the squid. So I hope you're going to enjoy it. So now I'm down in the wardroom, and it is a spectacular space for me. Stardust, there's this wonderful picture which is HMCS Haida. I'll stand like this so you can see it properly. That's Haida in the wake of HMCS Magnificent, the Canadian aircraft carrier. That is her going through that wake. You can see the bow wave of Magnificent rippling off there to go and get refueled from the carrier. So that's not a normal wave going over this ship. That's not it in rough seas. As you can look out, you can see the seas fairly calm. You have a ship like there, barely being touched. No, Haida is trying to get fuel from Magnificent. And then we have a lovely picture of Haida and Gira during the Battle of Ile-de-Basse, which I like to talk about, of course. The one that should protect the Battle of Shan, the sort of the one which protects D-Day. We have the wonderful The Wolf, who, this might get me in trouble in Canadian news, looking very tribal Captain Vian Sherbrooke in that picture. They look a certain way, but no, I think it's the thing that tribals have a certain style of commanding officer. They do get ones who are used to acting above and beyond themselves. But this whole wardroom is lovely. Yes, it does feature some very 1950s modifications, because it was reconditioned before the Korean War, but it is still a rather beautiful thing. And yes, there we go, we've got more footage. We've got the ship's cat. There we go. And we have a modern air cooling system, which is actually really quite essential, because this is really quite warm and a lovely space to go to. We have the dining facilities and the lounge facilities for the wardrobe for the officers. We have the cabinet, which was for the television, 1950s edition. And there we have her first wardroom team. It is simply magnificent, he says. Welcome to the Squid Room. These are where the mortar rounds are stored. Now, it gets incredibly hot in here, which is really not actually good for your squid mortars. Now, you can see on this side, the rollers have gone. But what would happen with these mortars is they would be rolled out from their storage onto this conveyor belt, or these rollers, then they rolled through, and then outside there's a little railway which gets them to the launchers. It's incredibly labor intensive. As you can see, a lot of this stuff is hand operated. There is assistance, but these systems are all about loading, not firing. The firing is controlled from the sonar room. These systems are literally about making sure these mortar rounds get from here to there.
Charges when she attacked the units of origin victims who were on Earth. Well, as you guys know, when you're attacking submarine, you have to move over it to drop the depth charges.
So, welcome to the 3-inch-50. It's an American style gun, but it's the sort of gun which in World War II, if they'd been able to get hold of, they would have been absolutely ecstatic. Why do I say absolutely ecstatic? Because it's amazing from an air defense perspective. This thing can pump out tons of ammunition, tons of shrapnel into the air, at a very good range, very high rate of fire, and very accurately. Thanks in part to a little radar up there, but also in part to the way it's put entirely designed. Now, oh, that 3-inch gun. Seriously, there's the 3-inch 70 developments, but the 3-inch 50s really do interest me because you can fit those in so many ship spaces. You really could have done. And that's why I do think the 3-inch 50 would have been more useful if we'd had a working one for the Falklands War than the 3-inch 70 necessarily, because there could have been more ships you could have probably retrofitted it with if it had been around and available for the British numbers to do so. But that's me going completely futuristic. This is the trouble with being a PhD in war studies rather than pure history. You do always think through rather than just going think about. It makes a difference. Ah, Mashona. I love these ships. I really do. Mashona, well, the desperate hunt for Bismarck was over. The Atlantic had swallowed the physical remnants of the anger, fear, and vengeance which the episode had created. The tribal destroyers, Tartar and Mashona, were making their way home at their most economical speed, trying to eke out their precious remaining fuel. It was at this precarious time the ships were discovered southward of Ireland by a roaming Focke-Wulf 200 Condor. Soon after this sighting, Hunkel HE-11 bombers appeared and started attacking. Waves of aircraft tried and failed to hit the already exhausted ships, but sometimes it can take just one lucky hit, or in this case, one unlucky bomb. Perhaps the middle bomb in one stick of bombs had a bent fin. It seemed to wobble a bit as it fell. That one did not miss. The rest did. It struck. Mashona's port side, abreast of fore funnel, penetrated number 1 boiler room and exploded there, blowing a huge hole in the side. Number 2 boiler room bulkhead and shoring up began. Number 2 boiler room bulkhead held and shoring up began, but nothing could be done with the forward bulkhead. It looked like a lace curtain. This was not the end of the attacks. Despite valiant efforts to keep the ship fighting, and most importantly, afloat, after 45 minutes their captain, Commander Selby, was forced to concede defeat. They abandoned ship and transferred to Tartar. Luckily for the ship's company, this tricky operation coincided with an hour-long lull in the bombing. The ordeal was not yet over, however. Demonstrating the toughness of design and construction that was a tribal trait, Mashona remained doggedly afloat. In fact, after Tartar and Mister with a torpedo, it was left to 2 more destroyers. Sherwood, a Clemson Town-class Lend-Lease destroyer, and HMCS St. Clair, a Wickstown-class Lend-Lease destroyer, which had joined them to sink Mashona with gunfire. They don't go down easy. Not even when you want them to go down, they don't go down easy. Mashona had already had an interesting career. She'd taken part in a Norwegian campaign. She, along with Tartar and Maori, had been the force which had seized 4 Swedish destroyers that had been purchased from Italy. It's an interesting event in the Faroe Islands. It causes issues with Sweden. But basically the thing was, the Royal Navy was very worried about the Swedes not getting these ships, especially after the fall of Norway. Matabe. Now, if I remember correctly, she is the vessel which I end the book with. I decided to pick 2 of the lesser known ships. The book started with the story of Mashona, and it seems appropriate to finish it with another story, that of Matabe. A ship that has, by comparison, hardly been mentioned. She survived the early years of the war until January 1942, when along with Somali she joined the escort of Arctic convoy PQ-8. The convoy had almost reached safety when the merchant ship SS Hamatris was torpedoed by a U-boat. Captain Lieutenant Hucklanders, U-454,
Hamatris was taken in tow by Speedwell, a Halcyon-class minesweeper, and as the rest of the convoy steamed ahead to gain the safety of harbour, the 2 tribal-class vessels were left to escort the tow. They were the vessels judged most capable of delivering the Hamatris, and most importantly, her cargo to their destination. They were the general-purpose destroyers, which stood a chance of protecting their charges against all threats. And indeed, this was a mission in which they would succeed. Although, as it turned out, not without loss. During the night, Matabe was sunk by a torpedo in another attack by U-454. There was no warning, and all but 2 of her crew were lost in the icy waters of the Arctic. It was another grim loss, another tribal sacrifice, but it was not in vain, for Hamatris, with her cargo, made it to Murmansk. And the cargo was important. When you go around the engine room, and if I'm not mistaken, that is what the next videos from the ship will be, you realise why it is such a big space and why it is such a full space, but also the amount of space water can get into if it gets into it. The boiler rooms, the engine rooms, these are huge cavernous spaces inside a very small, in comparison, hull. They are crammed with turbines, they are crammed with power, and yet, they are fragile. There is an interesting point made sometimes about destroyers in World War II, that they are sledgehammers made of eggshells. They carry these powerful weapons which have the ability to destroy ships many times their size. They carry guns which can obliterate armoured vehicles or fortifications, because unless they are built specifically for it, there isn't much built to withstand the level of fire which comes from a 4.7, even a 4.5 inch, let alone a 5-inch gun, when it's really intent on causing you damage. The amount of explosive and firepower it delivers. And yet they themselves, they have very little in the way of survivability once they get damaged. Very little. Ah, Micmac. This is her behind Huron. So really, this is the second photo of Huron. And it's a cool photo. It is. It's taken in 1950. The 11th of October 1950, and it's taken in Amsterdam, which I consider pretty darn cool. She was a very special vessel. Micmac was delayed in construction. She was built by the Halifax shipyards for $8.5 million Canadian dollars. She's laid down in May 1942, launched September 1943, and commissioned September 1945. She's then decommissioned officially in March 1964. Her in-service periods are 45 to 47, 49 to 51, and 53 to 64. In between time, she has refits from 47 to 49 and 51 to 53. And those refits take a long time, but she definitely earned her motto of being fearless. She survives economic issues, she survives political issues, civil political issues. And she also survives various sections of service politics. One of the things about Micmac is she's one of the first destroyers selected for being built at home in Canada. And selecting her was a big thing. Selecting the tribals was a big thing. They selected the tribal class destroyers because A, it gave them a high status unit, but also it was not a cruiser. It would give Canada something with cruiser-like capability, but it was not a cruiser. And that was important. That was important for Canada. And Nels, the Chief of the Naval Staff, made the right call. In 1922, the RCN had been almost down to the point at which it was going to be got rid of. It was so few. And that's also another reason why the tribal class are leapt upon by the RCN. And I think there's a political dimension to choosing the tribals as well. If you choose the tribal class and you name them after First Nations, whilst even in this period when we're talking about, the First Nations certainly didn't have the power and influence in terms of political power and influence they have today, they were still a factor in Canadian politics. They were still something that had to be considered. And it would add an extra dimension to any politicians deciding to cancel these ships. It's kind of like Britain, where our town class / now city class for the Type 26s are named after cities which tend to be quite critical constituency-wise. They tend to be cities which are either surrounded by or have contestable seats in them. Because, again, who wants to be the party which cancels that ship? It's cynical to put this in on a Christmas Day record video that's going out, but it's truthful. And now we have HMS Mohawk. Sunk by the Italian destroyer Luca Tarigo in what must be the most jammy shot ever. So, the 14th Destroyer Flotilla are escorting a convoy. They arrive at Malta on 10th 11th of April, and they then have orders to interdict the supply convoys between Italy and Libya. So they've survived so far. And the first two patrols completely uneventful. But the destroyers sortied on the 15th, hunting for a convoy of 5 cargo ships escorted by 3 destroyers. They were sortied on the early hours of the 16th of April. The commander of 14th DF, 14th Destroyer Flotilla, Captain Philip Mack, manoeuvred ships to silhouette the convoy against the moon, and closed range to roughly 2,400 yards before his flagship, which was Jervis, and her sister Janice, 2 J-class destroyers, opened fire on the trailing destroyer Baleine. Mohawk and Nubian were in the rear of formation and engaged the rearmost freighter, the SS Sabudia, which was carrying a load of ammunition. This, unsurprisingly, caused an explosion. A very big explosion. And as the sisters went down the convoy, Mohawk withheld fire as all targets were being engaged. At 02:35 hours, leading destroyer, Luca Tarigo, turned back and was under fire from all the British ships. As the Italian ship was sinking, it was sinking, her crew were able to fire 2 torpedoes under manual control. This is at night, while they're sinking, in the dark. The first of these strikes Mohawk, just as she turned to avoid being rammed by the SS Arta, a freighter, at 02:45 hours. The torpedo hits Mohawk on the starboard side abreast Y-gun mount, so about back there, blowing off the upper stern. Now, this is a hit which Nubian has to an extent survived, although hers was a little bit more further to the aft. The ship stops and is awash up to X-mount, and the chief engineer reported 5 minutes later that he believed that the propellers and their shafts were intact and the ship could move. However, before they could do so, another torpedo strikes the port side on the bulkhead. That separates the middle and aft boiler rooms. Now, I'm not sure how to explain that second torpedo. It could have circled round, but it's 1941. It could have just done all sorts of weird things, or it could conceivably have been a torpedo from another ship, i.e. an Allied ship. But there again, they're not in that position either that I'd expected one of their torpedoes to launch it. So it's a mystery torpedo. There's the jammy torpedo, which managed to go through the convoy and hit her, fired on manual. They fire a second torpedo, and honestly, it's probably nicer to give them give the Luca Terrigo the honor of that second torpedo, even though it does sink a tribal. But honestly, we're not sure how it gets there. Unsurprisingly, with the after boiler room also exploding and the upper deck now split down the middle, Mohawk capsizes a minute later, and her stern touches the bottom with a loss of 41 crewmen, and the British ships then rescue her surviving crew. Janice having to put some shells into her buoyant forecastle so that the ship would actually go fully underwater. It was still afloat. This is her, of course, dressed for the Spanish Civil War neutrality patrols with the flag on B mount. She was a good ship. Now, this lovely lady was the officer from HMCS Star who looked after us, and she arranged in her time off, so hence she's out of uniform, there was this memorial which we didn't know about, and she got us there. She got us in there. There was all sorts of things going on that day, and they weren't going to allow anyone in, and she talked us in like a diamond. So we have to say a massive thank you to her, because we wouldn't have got to see this wonderful thing, and the memorial to all of what the Canadian Navy did in World War II without her. So, and it was really, really fun. And really, walking around it was something. Welcome to the Tribal Class engine room. Yes, all these dials are what are needed to control the raw power which comes from the boilers. Unfortunately, we couldn't go into the boiler rooms, and I can understand it from a safety perspective. From a heart perspective, it was slightly more difficult to understand, and there are going to be two sections of going around the engine room. There's going to be this one, which is me narrating. Then after the next discussion of ships, you're going to just hear the sounds of me walking around the engine room with the camera on, trying to give you a view of what it's like to go around. Because we did 2 visits to the engine room. We did 2 visits because, well, honestly, that was what I was going to do. I wanted to go around the engine room. I wanted to have a good chat with the volunteers in there. I wanted to learn as much as I could about these engines, about these dials, about the way they had to control and run the ships, because so much of it isn't written down. So much of it is known by the people who were there because it was passed on to them by other people who were there. And that's one of the interesting parts of history. History is full of these things which are never written down. And one of the other interesting things is when you're in there and you're actually in the physical space, you realize just how much they're cramming into it. Because you might think if you go into something like Belfast or Iowa, that, you know, that will have more controls than you have in a destroyer, more dials. And it might have more numbers of them, but they'll need just as many dials to cover as many places. They'll have just as many places which need the dials, which need the coverage, which need you to be watching the pressure in this pipe, that pipe, all the different pipes, and learning what's going on so you can read the information coming from the boiler. That you can read what's coming out of the boilers, and that you can transmit this into the proper pitching of your turbines to get the best out of them. And that is something which is really an art form, but also you start to realize that it's not really a case of scaled up and down in terms of numbers of these controls. There are still the controls there. There might not be the quantity because there aren't the quantity of boilers and there aren't the quantity of turbines, but there are still just as many controls you need for each of those turbines and each of those boilers. And by gum, do they take up a lot of space. And you have the details of the turbo generators. You have the details of all the various systems which are hooked up to that steam to get every ounce of energy, every bit of pressure out of those boilers. That's going to give you power and let you do what you need to do. And it is an absolutely beautiful space. It's an absolutely amazing space to wander around. And it was something else to consider, the fact that this ship has been being wandered around for so many years. That Haida has been there, and Haida is the last representative of this class. It's so special. And yes, that is Naval getting away with playing with dials. He could, because he did it nicely and respectfully. But it was something to walk around. And then you remember that these engines, they are free Admiralty free drum boilers and 2 Parson geared steam turbine systems, developing 44,000 shaft horsepower. That this class had a top speed of 36.5 knots, although more normally 32 knots in service and at full weight. And of their 259 crew, that's 14 officers and 245 ratings, far too many for the size of space worked down in these rooms. Far, far too many. It was definitely close quarters work. With that in mind, I'm going to let you enjoy the walking around for a couple of minutes. Well, maybe a few seconds. Just in quiet, without me talking away. And then we'll get back to me in my office, talking through the class history. I hope you're enjoying the video. There is another most of an hour to go. It was a good trip. It was fun. And I hope you didn't mind a few seconds of silence to just enjoy looking at the engine room. You're going to get the noises of the engine room in the next video. Yes, engine rooms matter, and they will always matter as part of my videos. So, yeah. It's coming. Now, Nukta is another special vessel. She's laid down May 1942, launched April 1944, commissioned August 1946, and finally fully decommissioned on February 1964. She has Korea as her honours, and her motto translates as ready to fight. Now, I am going to try and pronounce it, and I'm going to apologise now. Tikke Mamuk Solex. Now, her badge is always something which really, really does make me think is cool. And I'm not going to show a picture of it. I want you to go look it up, because it is described, officially, as Azure in a base Barry wavy of 4 Argent and Azure, a killer whale orca, proper, rising from the sea. It's one of the coolest ship badges you will ever see. Anywhere. Now, this is her replenishing from RFA Wave Sovereign. HMS Ocean is also replenishing, and of course Nukta is off here. This is Korea 1952. And this is the point. There is often this idea that Commonwealth navies ends as an idea at the end of World War II. And actually, in the Korean War, I would say it reaches its height. You have Canadian carriers, Australian vessels, all sorts of things coming together and forming battle groups. Far more of an equal partnership than has ever been there before. And it's really cool to see. Now, please note, Nukta is named for the Nuu-sha-Nulth people. They were originally called the Nukta. And they're people of the Canadian Pacific coast. After commissioning, she'd been used as a training ship for the Atlantic Fleet. And she actually took part in Operation Scuttled, the training exercise designed to sink U-190, which was a Joan U-boat that had surrendered to the Royal Canadian Navy at the end of the Second World War. Unfortunately, before Nukta and her fellow ships could find the range on the submarine, the Naval Air Arm successfully attacked the vessel and sank her. The Naval Air Arm spoiling everyone's fun. Just what aviators do, isn't it? They spoil destroyers' fun. It's terrible. Then she, along with Haida, escorted Magnificent on a training cruise to Ungavine Peninsula in Quebec. They there left the aircraft carrier there and toured north, visiting Churchill, Manitoba, and becoming the first ever Royal Canadian Navy ships to penetrate Hudson Bay. She was a good ship. This was another very good ship. This is the ship where writing what happened to her and the section about her in my book, which is all about her career and her life, was the final thing I did for the book. Because Nubian just does it all. I mean, if battle honours were accrued in any slightly different way than they were for destroyers versus the capital ships, she would probably have beaten Warspite. And that's saying something. This ship does it all. She's in the Norwegian campaign, she's in the Mediterranean. She's at Calabria, Matapan, Sfax, Crete. She's starts off World War II in the Norway campaign. Then she spends her time with 14th Destroyer Flotilla. She takes part in landings in Sicily and Salerno. She takes whole surrenders during some of the campaigns in the Mediterranean of islands. At the end of 1944, she was being planned to be dispatched to the Far East to support the 21st Aircraft Carrier Squadron. And she went. And she was out there supporting the closing operations in Burma. She'd served through the entirety of World War II. She is never out of damage for long. During Crete, she's bombed and has her stern blown off. 7 of her crew are killed, 12 are wounded, and despite further attacks, she returns to Alexandria under escort, departs there on the 12th of June. This happened on 26th of May, under tow, and goes to get repaired at Bombay. Bombay is where she spends the next 18 months. That's her only downtime in World War II. She loses her stern. She takes a bomb so her carrier doesn't have to. She is built by John I. Thornycroft and Company, laid down on 10th of August at the in 1936 at the company's Woolston, Southampton shipyard. She cost £339,265, excluding weapons and communications, which were furnished by the Admiralty. Her completion was delayed because of the late delivery of her gun sights. Again, she is another ship scrapped in 1949. Punjabi had a very punchy career. She's actually sunk in collision with King George V on the 1st of May 1942. Yes, the battleship. So she doesn't go down to enemy action, she goes down to a miscommunication worthy of Beatty, but in their defence, they're providing distant cover for convoy PQ-15. But again, people sort of start to talk about PQ-17 and go, well, what's the convoy doing on this? What's the cover doing on this? Look at what's happened in some of the previous convoys. In convoy PQ-15, they've lost this destroyer because in the foggy conditions, she is rammed by the battleship. There's steaming in formation heavy fog. The lookout on Punjabi reported what he believed to be a mine dead ahead. Captain ordered a 15-point emergency turn to port, and in doing so, she sails directly into the path of King George V and is sliced in two by the battleship's bow. 169 of the ship's company were rescued from the forward section. Another 40 were picked up from the sea by other escorts, including the Marne. And those crew left in the aft section, which sank very quickly, were killed when her depth charges detonated. This led to the 49 of her crew losing their lives in the accident. She sank directly in the path of the USS Washington, which sailed between the halves of the sinking destroyer. Washington herself suffered damage from the depth charge detonation, and King George V sustained serious damage to her bow, which forced to return to port for repairs. What's even worse is that later on they don't find any trace of mines there, so they conclude there hadn't been, and it wasn't ever known if anything, the lookout had actually spotted. But there again, if you think you see a mine, you take action for it just in case. She had fought in the Arctic convoys. She had fought in Norway. She had taken part in the evacuation of Allied military and civil personnel from Saint-Nazaire. She had had a very full war, and the war was hardly any time old when she is lost. The war was only 1st of May 1942. It's not even reached its 3rd year, and she's lost. One of the interesting things about the tribals is if they make it through 1942, they tend to survive. And then we have Sikh. Sikh. Oh, one of my favourites. Oh, they're all my favourites, but she's definitely one of my favourites. She's another of the vessels, of course, at Cape Bon. And she's one of the vessels which, along with Zulu, one of her sisters, crewman Tetcott, sink the U-372 off Haifa, the German submarine. She took part, of course, in the sinking of Bismarck under the command of Commander Stokes, and fired a salvo of 4 torpedoes, claiming a hit, although the Bismarck crew claimed there were no hits. It's one of the interesting things about the Bismarck crew, whether or not the torpedoes actually hit or not. They might have hit and not gone off. They might have hit and gone off and just not done enough damage to actually be noticed. There's always that chance. She is one of 2 ships, her and Zulu, who get altered to take part in Operation Agreement, which was a commando raid on Tobruk. She was hit repeatedly, principally by 6-inch fire, but also 152mm, 145mm, and 120mm Italian coastal artillery also engaged. Some German sources like to attribute the fire entirely to German 88 guns, millimeter guns, but there really weren't many, if any, in the area actually able of firing on a ship. It's one of the interesting things. It's a debatable topic, and possibly was also bombed by a Macchi C-200. She's eventually hit by scuttling fire from HMS Krum. 115 men are lost, and more were taken prisoner. Majority of them being the Royal Marine landing craft personnel that they had rescued, them, which was captured by an Italian MZ Liza. Sad time. And this is a living legend. This is Marg. Now, she is a voice you're going to hear in the background on the next video. And she is the person who's taking care of the engine room. And basically it's thanks to her. She was one of the first, I think was the first, or possibly one of the first, female stokers in the Royal Canadian Navy. She is an absolute amazing font of information. She has been heavily involved in keeping Haida the way she is and preserving her. She is an absolute inspiration to talk to. I was lucky enough to get to chat with her 2 days, 2 days while we were there, and I got to chat with her both times. The first time we were on the ship, Drac didn't actually get to see her, chat with her. And so, when we went back in, I said, you have to go see Mark, and you have to. And you have never seen a happier Drac than spending, I think, possibly close to 2 hours chatting with Marg about Ancients. I mean, the smile on his face, the smile on her face, it was the absolute meeting of minds. And it was just a wonderful time. And I have to say for myself, listening to her talk, it brought back many memories of my own father and chatting with him about these things. It really did. It was wonderful to listen to her and wonderful to learn from her. You're going to hear a little bit, but I do recommend if you go see Haida, make sure you go on the days when she is there and you get down in the engine rooms and you have her explain the engines to you. They will come alive in your mind. They really will.
Okay, ladies, we want to I hope that helped you a little bit.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Don't worry about that.
The high pressure turbine. Drive shafts.
Low pressure, high pressure outboard.
We produce two types of steam, saturated steam and distributed steam. Has anybody seen saturated steam? No,
Got the inspection hatch off.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if one had water. What happens when you boil water? What about boiling the oil? You got steam, that's saturated steam. Meaning saturated steam always got to be in contact with water. Steam.
Look at all those
So you take
pipes.
the lid off something, you see water dropping? That's saturated steam. What happens is that we use that for heating our ship, we heat our fuel tanks, we use it for heating the water, we use it for now, here's the other steam.
Manufactured by Verities Limited, Birmingham. Controller for 20-inch fan motor. 220 volts. Manufacture number year 1942.
Looking right by the fire, meaning, that's not the steam from the kitchen, and even the heater, I don't know all the motion. Now it's got a gas burner, it's steam. That steam leaves the boiler room at 600 degrees, 300 psi, will come directly over into this position right here. These are our 341.
I worked in a hospital which was pretty much in the middle between Portsmouth and Plymouth. Nice place to retire and go. So actually just by way from Portland. So we had a lot of people who done time in a dockyard or in the Navy when there was asbestos with asbestos. They're on to the end.
Going ahead, using, and going to steam. This one's for going ahead, this one's for going to stern, and this one's for cruising. I got it.
But the old section,
Now,
they have a retrofit.
when you open this throttle here,
So when you look up at the pipe,
that shaft is going to open that big
it
valve
goes
right
fast.
here. So now your steam cannot flow into these positions.
That's why it arrives.
Your steam will then flow through here, through that valve, now through another pipe, all the way around to the These are our turbine blades. Rotaries. These are fixed. So this will sit down now. Your steam goes in comes inside the house. I think it's under one of the legs. Now, as it goes through the Naval, steam gets in. There's fixed ways, there's good steam, and then fixed rubber to touch. So steam has to go through. So these are called rapid blades. It's a beautiful kind of process. I'm going to show you static. So as you steam goes through the piston range, and gassing goes through the pipe, all the way around, over into the middle of the low pressure, which now from the drop right down into this.
She really is a superstar. All the people on Haida were absolutely amazing, and frankly, they couldn't have made us feel more welcome if they tried. They really couldn't have. And we have HMS Somali, torpedoed by U-703 and sank under tow, 25th September 1942. Again, for all their toughness and their ability to hold together, one of the things you can never really design out of a destroyer vessel this size is the fact that once they do get into trouble when they've got water on board, as you saw, there's such huge spaces. And one of the things about them is that those spaces need to be huge. because they are basically, how do I put this right? A destroyer is a giant engine with a hull built around and some weapons put on top. That is literally what a destroyer is. The engine is completely outsize of what the vessel is. If you're building building a vessel for any other reason other than to be a destroyer, you would never put in that much engine, that much machinery in a hull that size and that shape. You just wouldn't. Somali actually achieved, though, her claim to fame on the 3rd of September 1939. She intercepted the Hanna Bog, 350 miles south of Iceland, a German freighter, and she took her as prize. This was the first enemy merchant ship to be captured during World War II. Yeah. It's done by a Tribal-class destroyer. She also carried Brigadier Honourable William Fraser into Harstad. He was the commander of 24th Guards Brigade for reconnaissance of Meaux, and she's bombed by German aircraft, forced to return to the UK for repairs, and takes the brigadier with her. So he did not reach Harstad until the 23rd of May. She took him in there on the 15th of May 1940 during the Norway campaign. On 23rd of October, she, along with Punjabi and Punjabi, shelled and sank WES-5 Adolf Vinen in Norwegian Sea off Statland, which was, of course, a weather ship. And, well, she was the leader for 6th Destroyer Flotilla. So the two Tribal-class destroyer flotillas were 4th and 6th. Or 1st and 2nd, and then eventually 4th and 6th. And spends most of 1940-1941 with the home fleet. In May 1941, she boarded another German weather ship, the München. The crew of the München threw overboard the ship's Enigma machine in a weighted bag. However, the documents on the Operation Enigma were left on board, as were vital code books, which kind of helped the Allied code breakers. Rather helpful when you do that. And that was May 1941. And in August 1942, she rescued all 105 crew of the American cargo ship Amiria Lykes, which had been torpedoed by E-boats while taking part in Operation Pedestal. She landed those crew at Gibraltar. She was a very good ship. A very, very good ship. Lucky Tata. Oh, she's a gorgeous one. She really is. She is one of the 4 that survive World War II. She's sold for scrap 6th of January 1948. She has 12 battle honours. She's authorised under the 1936 naval estimates. She's part of the 9. There are 7 authorised in 1935, 9 in 1936, and this is what gives them the 16 of the 2 flotillas. Her period of being known around the world starts actually with the Thetis incident, where the Thetis, a submarine in development and testing, sinks in Liverpool Bay. Her and the Tribal-class destroyers of, I think at the time, I seem to remember they were they were 2nd Tribal Destroyer Flotilla, weren't they? Home Fleet one. Yes, the 2nd, they become the 6th. Were key ships sent out there. Again, I do talk about this in my book because it's an important part of the Tribal story. The fact they're there and they are big enough to actually do the job. They're small enough to be able to spare to do the job. They're big enough to do the job. And they have all the required equipment. During her career, well, she screens the battleship Prince of Wales when it's carrying Winston Churchill back from his Atlantic charter meeting President Roosevelt. And along that trip, Prince of Wales overtook an eastbound convoy of 73 ships, turning around and passing through the convoy so the Prime Minister and a merchant ship could greet each other. Really lovely. But Tartar was probably more thankful for the extra time it bought her, because when they arrived at River Clyde, the Prime Minister was transferred to Tartar to be taken to Greenock for his return to London. Yes. They went from being escort to being the primary. Yes, my lord. We will make sure the Prime Minister gets that. Do not worry. She takes part in the Mediterranean, in Norway, in the English Channel, the Far East. She even takes part as part of the covering force for Operation Dracula, which was the Allied landings at Rangoon. That's an operation to take part on. HMAS Warramunga. I don't know. Laid down February 1940, launched February 1942, and commissioned November 1942. Decommissioned finally December 1959. Battle Honours: Pacific 1943 to 45, New Guinea 1943 to 44, Leyte Gulf 1944, Lingyan Gulf 1945, Borneo 1945, Korea 1950 to 52. Again, one of the most highly decorated ships in Australian service. Named for the Warramunga Aborigines. She has a war and a half. And, as she's one of the first Australian vessels assigned to the Far East Strategic Reserve, and in April 1957 she was involved in the SEATO exercises, that's the Southeast Asia Treaty Organisation exercises. She operated in 1958 with the Strategic Reserve again. Would eventually be towed to Japan for shipbreaking. Now, when she's launched, she's armed with 6 4.7-inch guns in the twin turrets, 2 4-inch guns in the twin turret, and a quad-barreled 2-pounder Mark 8 pom-pom, 6 20mm Oricons, a quadruple 21-inch torpedo tube, and depth charge rails. This is a picture of her in 1946, post-war. With all the fittings and accoutrements you'd expect of a war-serving destroyer. Complement was 7 officers and 190 sailors. And range was listed as 1,030 nautical miles at 32 knots, or 2,840 nautical miles at 8 knots. And she very much did do the top speed of 36.5 knots. She was actually hit during Lingyan Gulf, well, nearly hit by a Japanese kamikaze aircraft, which decided to instead to crash into the USS Brooks. I don't think Brooks was very happy with the kamikaze aircraft deciding it preferred it to, well, her to Warramunga. But, you know, you hang around next to a tribal, they do have a habit of turning up in areas where where there's going to be heavy fighting. The idea is not to sail near them. And then we have HMS Zulu. Now, I've already discussed her end. Her end, you know, comes as part of, well, the Operation Agreement, which is a very fun name for an actual commando operation. But she actually has a lot of service before that. A lot of service. She'd been employed escorting convoys around the western approaches. She'd been dry docked and degassed with turbinitis in 1940. And she was built by Alexander Stevenson's, laid down on 27th August at the company's Linthouse shipyard. Now, the Linthouse shipyard is a pretty cool one in Glasgow. She was a good ship. And her end is slightly different from her sister's end. They're in the same operation, but when Sink is sunk, Zulu is able to save the lives of several of her crew. Later same day, Coventry, C-class light cruiser converted to AA defense, was damaged by Ju-88s as well. Dead in the water on fire with 63 killed, she was scuttled by gunfire and torpedoes from Zulu. So that's Coventry gone. Aircraft then continued to attack Zulu, and she's badly damaged, and left without engine power about an hour later. The commanding officer decided the attacking aircraft were a combination of Ju-88s and Ju-87s, but I would say that that seems to be a popular thing amongst commanding officers when they're identifying aircraft coming into them. They do seem to pick 88s and 87s as the common aircraft. Thankfully, at this point, HMS Chrome, a Type 2 Hunt-class destroyer, one of those little escort destroyers, comes alongside to take off the surviving personnel. Save for a towing party, and Zulu is taken under tow by HMS Hursley. Now, Hursley was another Type 2 Hunt-class destroyer. By 1900 hours, on the 14th of September, about 100 miles from Alexandria, it was clear she was sinking, and the towing party was recovered after more aircraft carried out a strafing past. She rolled to starboard and sank in position, 32 degrees north, 28 degrees 56 east. Across both tacks she'd lost 12 men killed, 27 were missing, and 1 was wounded. So I'm going to say now, the end of this video is just a long video of HMCS Haida. Just looking at her from the side when I was walking around it. It's worthwhile looking at for that. That's all you'll see. This was a class of great virtues. And yes, I've got the coolest picture I took, which is me and Drac standing on top of B-mount with the bridge behind us, looking off into the distance and thinking, could we hit that railway line from here? But no, seriously. That's why he's looking like he's contemplating maths and I'm grinning like an idiot. But the whole time going around, I honestly couldn't believe I was aboard a tribal class destroyer finally. Because these ships do so much. They get written out of history because it's very easy to write out destroyers, and it's very easy to write out outliers. There is this line in Game of Thrones, which I haven't read the books enough to know, and I haven't really read the books at all. My family members had them, and I haven't bothered to read them really, and I haven't really watched the programs. But there is a line I remember from Tyrion Lannister, who says, "All dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes." I hope that's not true, but there is a sort of thinking about it when I was thinking about it that it's true, in that everything that is different, or is in some ways not part of a normal group, it either is ignored or the normal group adapts to it. But the trouble is, by the time the normal group adapts to it, we're post-World War II and it's the Darings. And then the missile cruisers, missile destroyers and all those things come in, and everyone can explain that these ships becoming general purpose capability assets is part of the missile age. It's not something which was already coming. And yet, if you go back to these vessels, they are very much your general purpose vessels. And that's what they do the whole way through World War II. In my book, I write, and I know I keep referring to it, but I spent many years working on that book. I'm going to keep referring to it. I've got a book. I'm an academic with a book. Yay. They, because of their capabilities, because of what they could do, pushed their luck more and more. They're called upon to do so many things. And that's their history. Now, this is, of course, and that's why they run out of luck, honestly, if you go through them. They run out of luck because they keep being called to push their luck, because there's nothing else. There are no other destroyers with a sufficient gunpower capability to both back up commandos and get themselves out of the necessary fighting line and fighting positions. There are no other destroyers which have both the torpedoes, depth charges, and guns, and all the magazines to support those things, and the size to take commandos for doing the risky operations. And that's why the tribals get called upon. So to the future, what are we planning next? Well, it's in the planning stages, but it's very early planning stages. We still haven't completed a list of what we'd like to go. I think the same group would like to go to Australia together and have a look at the last Daring class destroyer that's out there, HMCS Vampire, and probably a few other things. So the question for this video is two things. One, did you enjoy it? Because if I'm going to keep making videos like this, I need to know people. I hope people like them. Although, to an extent, even if people didn't, I'd probably still make them because I enjoy it. But I'd like to know if I'm actually pitching it right. And secondly, suggestions for Australia. I keep asking for them, and more keep coming in. Every time I ask for them, I get whole new ones which I haven't heard of before. It seems to me Australia is very good at hiding their naval history from anyone looking for it. So please, please, send me suggestions of ships we should look at. What else have I got coming up? We've got the Battle of Coronel, in retrospect, on the 6th of January. And Albany class, I hope the recording works. I've done it this morning. If it doesn't work, it might come out on Boxing Day. It might not. I will apologize in advance. But I did do a 5-hour live on Friday, so I think that sort of covers me if I fail, but I will try. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with this. I'm going to say thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it all. I hope it hasn't been too long. And just enjoy HMCS Haida. That's what I did. She's an amazing looking ship. And I am so thankful to all the people, volunteers, local government, national government, Parks Canada, all those people who not only made the trip possible but have kept her alive and kept her there and keep her going still. Honestly, they are such heroes in my eyes. They really are. Thank you very much for watching and take care.